Now it came to my mind that it would also be a good idea to offer some kind of summary on the HIV videos that I made, because I tend to digress too much. My videos are far too long now. So here is my summary. I will stick to the summary now. I wonder how long it'll take me till I do digress. Now, in the framework of a slightly odd dissertation project about anal fissure, I think I might have solved on a sidetrack, as it were, the main transmission routes of HIV in detail. And I think that more effective, easy and funny prevention measures also follow. So I think I found the cause, and I also found the treatment or the prevention measures in order to stop HIV. Or the main routes of transmission, in order to block the main routes of transmission. The factors of transmission discussed so far seem to be slightly off the mark, both for MSM and for the general pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. The problem is, in my opinion, anatomical or physiological in nature, rather than due to promiscuity or other variables of sexual behavior, to sex drugs, to other STIs, etc. The persons affected are really in no way to blame, and if I am correct, I dare say that HIV/AIDS researchers so far have really been idiots. In MSM, a relative anal stenosis is responsible for the spread, which is present in at least 12 to 33% of anal-receptive MSM. One study says 12%, another study says 14% of anal-receptive men who have sex with men have severe anodyspareunia, that is the pain during anal intercourse, and about 33% of anal-receptive men have anal bleeding at least sometimes during intercourse. Anal bleeding has long ago been found as an eminent risk factor for transmission, but these studies have been ignored with vigor. This stenosis leads to anal micro and macro tears through which HIV gets access to the blood circulation. The relative stenosis can be easily remedied with the help of regular anal dilation, be it self-dilation with instruments, with sex toys and so on, more compact stools, or regular anal intercourse. And the time interval here should be less than about 5 days according to anecdotal and theoretical evidence. In sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in blacks in North America, who disproportionately make up 50% of HIV-infected people in the US already, quite the same problem could be the cause. The mismatch between lock and key, male and female part here, is on the one hand due to a higher penile caliber in men, and on the other hand to a common shape variant of the vagina in women. Black women have the so-called pumpkin seed shape of the vagina in about 40%. That is the rate of that was found in Afro-American women at least. Yes, they have a shape variant of the vagina that does not occur in other ethnic groups, and they also have a significantly narrower vaginal introitus, 3.14 or 3.73 centimeters in diameter, as compared to 4.66 or 4.66 centimeters in Caucasians. I think my arguments and sources support these factors very well, and I am somewhat surprised that they have not been discussed very much or at all so far. Possibly this has to do with the taboo nature of sexuality and the details of copulation. Given that HIV has high concentrations in seminal fluid, in semen, this fact could almost literally be the evolutionary success strategy of HIV. But now I put a spoke into HIV's wheel. I know I am some kind of a freak to discuss these taboo subjects, but I think this hypothesis explains in a way almost all about HIV transmission. It explains almost all of the phenomena in HIV transmission. It explains why in sub-Saharan Africa, Madagascar has surprisingly low HIV rates, because people there have a totally different ethnic origin. It explains higher maternal death rates in blacks everywhere in the world, because if they have bleeding during birth, it is more severe due to their anatomy. I already discussed African women using spheres or balloons in order to dilate the vagina before birth. That might also be a hint that the anatomy of the vagina of African women is different from that of women of a different ethnic origin. It explains why sedative, relaxant sex drugs are associated with a higher rate of infection among MSM, because there is a common cause for both variables, for the use of sex drugs, sedative, relaxant, analgesic sex drugs, and for higher infection rate, and that is the anal stenosis. The hypothesis also explains the curious result from about 3 years ago that lubricants would give you HIV more likely. It is the common cause again, anal stenosis. If you have anal stenosis, it is more likely that you will really have to use lubricants, water-based lubricants, in order to have intercourse. Saliva or other fluids will not be enough. And now people only think, I also explained in detail in the videos, people only think that lubricants help with stenosis. Sure, they do reduce friction, and I also recommend using lubricants. They reduce friction, which is a good thing, but physically, the reduction of friction is not the same as creating more dermal or epithelial circumference in the anus. Now, this hypothesis also explains all the other risk factors that have been discussed so far in HIV transmission. It explains why promiscuity is a factor. Apart from the very sensible point that it is more likely to meet someone who is infected when you are promiscuous, we also know from sexual behavior studies that people who have different, always new sex partners have sex less regularly. They have sex less regularly than people in steady relationships. Casual sex is sometimes surprisingly hard to get. Sometimes it is concentrated on the weekend, and that distance from weekend to weekend may be too long for the anus of the anal-receptive man to stay wide, especially if he does not have feces of a high caliber. Other STIs, the other factor. Yes, that's a major factor indeed. But why the hell do the people mainly affected by HIV get more STIs in the first place? Or if the number of STIs is equal in people who get HIV more likely and other people, why do the ulcers and the inflammations caused by STIs facilitate transmission of HIV in some people and not in others? The hypothesis also explains why highly exposed but persistently seronegative sex workers in Kenya, once thought to be immune to HIV, caught it after retiring or taking longer breaks from their business. And yes, most of them have been abstinent from sex during that time. Their vaginas got narrower, and then once they had sex again, there were new tears produced, and this is how they caught it. It explains why starting sex work during the 80s in sub-Saharan Africa is associated with being protected against seroconversion. To put it in colloquial terms, the old whores didn't catch it, the young whores caught the disease, because the vagina experienced regular dilation in the old sex workers during the 80s already, and therefore no more bleeding or micro tears occurred when HIV started to become pandemic in 85 to 90, or was already in 93 to 95, whereas starting sex work in about 94 was associated with 100-fold increased risk of seroconverting, because when the young sex workers' vaginas or introituses were being widened, again, the black vagina may be anatomically narrower, may tighten more easily again. When the young sex workers' vaginas or introituses were being widened then in 94, HIV/AIDS was already pandemic as opposed to the early 80s. It explains why mainly young people, especially young women, are affected. In young people, women are much more affected than men. There are also a few studies about vaginal bleeding during sex in South Africa, and yes, it occurred in about 26, that was the female view, to 30%, that was what the males reported, of sexually active people sometimes, and it was more common in people of African ethnic origin. Bleeding, really bleeding in heterosexual intercourse is said to be rare in Caucasian subjects, about 3%, or I read a number of 3 or 4%, etc., etc. All the other factors, poverty, sexual violence, sex work, gender inequality, etc., are not really specific for the south of Africa. They may in some contribute to the spread, but none of these as major factors, I think. Because if you look at the numbers, for example, for sexual violence, if you look at the numbers, not many more rapes per 100,000 were reported during recent years in Zimbabwe than, for example, in Belgium or the US or UK. Yes, Zimbabwe has a very high number of HIV infected people in heterosexuals, about 10, 15, 20, that's about the number that they have. In 2004 it was a bit over-reported, so I also apologize for quoting the 2004 numbers in the detailed videos. I'm digressing now. As I said it, I would be digressing. Where was I? Yes, Zimbabwe has a rate of about 10-15% of HIV positives in the heterosexual population, but there were not many more rapes in Zimbabwe than in Belgium, the US or UK. I think it was about 40 rapes per 100,000 in Zimbabwe, and in Belgium it's about 30, the US or UK about 20 to 30 rapes, so it's not much more. In South Africa, I do admit that there is something of a rape epidemic. Gender inequality and poverty can be found in tons of other places in the world where HIV is not pandemic. Also, the myth about dry sex, I talked about dry sex in one of the videos, the myth about dry sex in Africa isn't really a factor if you look at the evidence. However, being black or MSM is specific for HIV reaching epidemic rates, and this is where we have to look at. This is where we have to look at for conquering the spread. And in my view, it can be easily done. So please, let's do it together. I'd be happy to be a co-author of your studies. I'm an undergraduate student, at least as far as medicine is concerned, and I have no institutional affiliation to initiate research, and this topic, this subject, seems kind of an intricate subject that few people are willing to work on. But I am subjectively quite sure that I am on the right track. 95% sure to have identified the main cause in MSM, and about 75% sure to have found it for sub-Saharan Africa, because now I honestly failed to explain the main transmission routes to the heterosexual male so far. It might have to do with the vaginal shape variant or some penile dermal variable, but that's only an awkward guess. Now, I criticized the circumcision campaigns a bit, but maybe even circumcision may really help. There is some evidence that circumcision may help. The causal mechanism might also be that the skin of the penile gland, of the gland's penis, may get more robust due to circumcision, and then female to male transmission might become less probable if you're circumcised. Now, also, I know that the theory that bleeding and similar things are responsible for transmission is rather old school in HIV research. But, firstly, I think that mucosal transmission, some people claim that mucosal transmission is enough. You don't have to have bleeding in order to catch HIV. But I think firstly, mucosal transmission does not explain many of the transmission phenomena just mentioned. Secondly, it would involve the theory that mucosal transmission is the main route of transmission for HIV. Secondly, that would involve at least in the rich countries, some kind of a distinction or difference between the susceptibility of the rectum to HIV infection on the one hand and of the vagina on the other. But unless there should be some fundamental difference in the vaginal lining of women in sub-Saharan Africa, this hypothesis does not explain the heterosexual pandemic of HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. If you say the rectum is more prone to HIV infection than the vagina, this theory is refuted by the epidemiological evidence that HIV/AIDS has a heterosexual spread in sub-Saharan Africa. The vagina of African women has about the same bacterial milieu. It also has stratified epithelium. Well, that's what people always say without much empirical evidence for that. They say, well, the rectum, yes, it has columnar epithelium. It only has one stratum of epithelium, whereas the vagina, at least up until the cervix, there the epithelium changes. But the vagina has stratified epithelium, squamous epithelium, stratified about 9 strata, so it is epithelium that is thicker, and that's why the vagina has protects more against HIV transmission. But that cannot be the case, because there is a heterosexual spread in sub-Saharan Africa. Black women also have stratified epithelium with about 10 strata of cells. Black women also have a sensitive cervix where the epithelium changes to columnar epithelium, where you have only one layer of cells, but still there is no considerable heterosexual spread in the so-called developed world, at least not in non-blacks, despite that sensitive mucous monolayer of cells in the cervix. There only is a heterosexual spread in the south of Africa. So I do not think that African women mainly have anal sex like MSM. They may have about 10%. I found a number in a study that about 10% of heterosexual women also have receptive anal intercourse regularly. But I do not think that African women mainly have anal sex like MSM. So this cannot be a factor. So of course the rectum has mold, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, with M cells that transport antigens like HIV to lymphoid tissue and to CD4 positive lymphocytes. Yes, the vagina does not have M cells, but the vaginal epithelium does almost the same thing via dendritic cells. Dendritic cells take up the HIV virus or other pathogens and present it to lymphoid tissue. But still, infection through the intact vaginal epithelium seems prima facie less likely, and just because it is, in my opinion, just as likely or unlikely as in the rectum. Because, for example, the tonsils are rich in M cells too, but oral cells with ejaculation and no wounds present seems to have a negligibly low risk of becoming infected or of infection. So M cells per se cannot be responsible for the transmission of HIV. Some people say that, well, the rectum absorbs fluid, etc. But HIV is not a fluid, so it cannot enter the rectal epithelium so easily. Yes, saliva, as far as the tonsil versus rectum difference is concerned, saliva is a bit hostile to HIV. Yes, there is evidence for that. But the rectum and anal lining also has very high immunological capacities, because some studies show that extreme hygiene is not really needed for anal and rectal wounds to heal adequately after operation. They do heal. The rectum has extraordinary immunological capacities. As I said, the stool has about 10 to the power of 13 bacteria per gram. But still, the rectum usually does not get infected with these bacteria. On some websites where you find general information about HIV transmission, people praise the vagina for its immunological capacities, because it has about, well, 10 to the 10th to the power of 10 or so bacteria. It also has a high load of bacteria that protects against other bacteria. So people ask themselves, how does the vagina do that? But the rectum succeeds in protecting itself against stool that has about 10 to the power of 13 bacteria per gram of stool. So the rectum is a very good immunological organ also, despite or maybe even because of the monolayer, the columnar epithelial, the columnar epithelium that it has. So also, the highly exposed but persistently seronegative sex workers in Kenya, they have tons of mucosal antibodies and CD8 positive lymphocytic reactions against HIV going on without actually becoming HIV positive as a systemic infection. Yes, what goes on with these M cells in the rectum seems to be quite the same thing to me. That is, the formation of a mucosal defense. The M cells in the rectum and the dendritic cells in the vagina start a mucosal defense against HIV, and this defense seems to be successful. HIV does not become a systemic, does not go to the whole system. It does not become a systemic infection. HIV that mainly use CCR5 receptors of CD4 positive cells, that's the majority, seem to be eliminated by the M cell processing or by the dendritic cell processing. They don't enter the blood circulation or the system as a whole. I admit, however, that CR-tropic HIV has been shown to cross the epithelial barrier through the M cells, as do some other intestinal pathogens, but even they rarely go systemic. So the rectal mucosa seems to be able to defend itself against HIV if it does not break, if HIV cannot enter the blood circulation. Also, this thesis that HIV/AIDS can enter the body through mucosal epithelium, this thesis, I don't think that it has really been proved in a convincing way. Yes, it might be possible, but I do not think that empirically, in real infection rates or infection processes, that this route of transmission has been proved. Because it is very difficult to prove. Because if you want to prove that HIV can enter the body via intact mucosa, via intact mucosal epithelium, you would have to show that there are no micro and macro tears produced in the anus or in the vaginal introitus or in the vagina. You would have to prove that there are no small tears, no cracks in the skin of the anus or in the vagina. If you want to prove that mucosal entry of the virus suffices for a systemic infection. But this is quite difficult. In my self-experiment, I realized that these small cracks in the skin, that these micro tears or that these paper cuts in the skin, they heal in 2 to 3 days, 1 to 3 days. They're healed and you can't see them anymore. So you would either have to show that that an HIV infection occurs without there ever having been small tears, small cracks in the skin of the anus or vagina. This is very hard to monitor. You would have to check the anus or the vagina almost every day. This is what I did in my self-experiment. I watched what happened with the anus when it experiences various degrees of dilation. Or you would have to positively prove that there is a mucosal entry of the virus. How would you be able to do that? It's very difficult too. You would have to, well, maybe take biopsies of the rectum, of the rectal mucosa, and see what cells the virus reached. You would have to monitor mucosal antibodies, e.g. IgA antibodies against HIV, for example. Or you would have to monitor this M cell processing. The M cells take up the pathogens or parts of the pathogens, present them to CD4 positive and CD8 positive lymphocytes, which destroy them. Then you would have to monitor that continuously and then see whether the person has caught a systemic HIV infection. This is quite difficult to do, and through the biopsy also you would endanger infecting the subject because of bleeding, because of larger trauma through that biopsy of the rectal mucosa. So I do not think that elaborate studies about the theory that mucosal entry suffices for HIV infection have been done. I do not think that there have been many studies about mucosal infection that really prove that mucosal entry is enough. Maybe there are, and I'd also be very interested in looking at these studies. If you know about some studies, I'd be happy to look into these. But I have a feeling that they have not really been done, and that because they are quite difficult to do. You would have to either prove that there are no tears in the skin, that there is no trauma, no microtrauma in the skin or in the mucosa of the anal canal, or for that matter of the rectum. But I don't think that these occur very frequently. It's anal tears that are responsible. Or you would have to positively prove that the HIV virus has really entered through the rectal mucosa. And this is almost as difficult as proving that there were never tears in the anal canal or in the rectum. Now, on the other hand, there are many hints, empirical hints. For example, the thing about sex drugs, relaxant sedative sex drugs. There are many hints that point to the fact that anal stenosis is responsible for the transmission of HIV. There are many hints that aim or that point to the fact that a vaginal stenosis, or that a stenosis or a narrow introitus of the vagina in African women is responsible for infection. And this should be tested. Through regular dilation, people should avoid these cuts, these paper cuts, these micro tears, and then you will see, or you can see maybe, that infection rates decrease. This would prove that micro tears, or that the caliber of vaginal introitus or of the anus are responsible for the spread of HIV. This should be tested. Now, so rather than considering a specific difference between anus and rectum and vagina, which again seems totally implausible for HIV transmission, or as a factor for HIV transmission, simply for epidemiological reasons, people should actually have been trying to find a specific similarity between anus and rectum in MSM and vagina in sub-Saharan Africa all along already. And now I think I did that. I found the similarity between anus and rectum in MSM and vagina in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is what explains the spread of HIV/AIDS. And this is also the point, or the factor which we should influence in order to stop the spread of HIV/AIDS. Dilation is equally effective, I think, in women in sub-Saharan Africa as in men who have sex with men, both in the developed countries and also in sub-Saharan Africa. Use regular dilation or have sex regularly.